Hello friends, before you listen to this criminal story, we need your help to subscribe to this channel and share with friends about this crime. Thank you. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked cobblestones as twilight settled over Paris. The narrow streets of Montmartre bustled with evening life. Street performers entertaining tourists, cafe terraces filled with laughter, and the murmur of the Seine in the distance. Hidden among the vibrance was Elodie Durand, a 35-year-old art conservator, making her way home from the Musée d'Orsay. She paused at a pedestrian crossing, adjusting the strap of her leather satchel, filled with notes on 19th-century restoration techniques. It had been a long day at work, but the satisfaction of completing her research on a newly discovered Degas pastel carried her home with a lightness she rarely felt. Elodie turned into Rue des Abysses, a quieter street lined with boutique shops and art galleries. The shadows stretched longer here, the dim streetlights casting flickering halos on the pavement. A soft rustling in the alley nearby caught her attention. It wasn't unusual to hear stray cats scavenging, but this sound was different, deliberate, like footsteps trying to blend with the ambient noise. Her pulse quickened. Paris was safe, or so she believed. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the dimly lit street. No one. She shook off the unease and picked up her pace, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Then the sound returned, closer this time. She clenched her satchel tightly and reached for her phone. Just as she unlocked the screen, a van screeched around the corner, headlights glaring. Its tires skidded on the slick road, stopping directly in front of her. The sliding door flew open. A masked figure jumped out, his gloved hands grabbing her arm before she could react. "Non, lâchez-moi," she screamed, twisting and kicking. The figure's grip tightened, yanking her into the dark interior of the vehicle. The door slammed shut. The street fell silent once more, as if nothing had happened. The van sped off, leaving only a single high-heeled shoe on the wet pavement. Meanwhile, across town, Inspector Matthew Lemoyne, a seasoned detective with the Parisian police force, was finishing his third cup of espresso in his office at the Prefecture de Police. Files were stacked haphazardly on his desk, cases of petty thefts and missing persons, nothing out of the ordinary. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Disappearance on Rue des Abysses. Witness reports abduction. No ID on the victim yet. Matthew sighed, grabbing his coat. This was Paris, after all, a city of beauty but also of shadows. He had seen too much to believe in coincidences. By the time he arrived at the scene, the rain had begun again, washing away the last traces of the crime. Only a small crowd remained, gathered around the single shoe in the middle of the road. Matthew bent down, picking it up carefully. He stared at it for a moment, his mind already racing through possibilities. He didn't yet know who Elodie was or what had happened to her, but something about this felt wrong. Very wrong. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky above Paris remained cloaked in a blanket of dull gray. Inspector Matthew Lemoyne sat at his desk, the high-heeled shoe resting on a blotter in front of him. The single piece of evidence so far, a slim, black heel, had been carefully bagged and labeled the previous night. The shoe was ordinary in every way, the type countless women wore daily in the city. It offered him nothing. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, his mind still circling the same frustrating question. Who was the woman taken on Rue des Abysses? The security footage from nearby businesses had been pulled overnight. Bruno, a junior officer, wheeled in a cart with several hard drives and a laptop, plugging everything in without a word. Matthew watched as the grainy black and white video from the street played on the monitor. The timestamp read 8:17 p.m. The footage captured the van. It appeared suddenly, turning onto the street at an odd angle before skidding to a stop. 2 minutes later, it sped away, leaving only a dark blur in its wake. The quality was poor, but it was enough to confirm a deliberate abduction. "There's no license plate," Bruno said, squinting at the screen. "It's been blacked out." Matthew frowned. Professional kidnappers, perhaps? Too well coordinated for a random street crime. Something was off. He rewound the footage several times, slowing it frame by frame. His eyes narrowed at a faint reflection of the van's side in a storefront window. A logo, barely visible, caught his attention. Something circular. A symbol or text, partially obscured by shadows. He made a note to have it enhanced. It was a small lead, but in cases like this, small leads were everything. "Bruno," he said, keeping his eyes on the screen. "I need a full check on all vans with similar dimensions registered within the last 3 years. Look for anything with a logo resembling this shape. Focus on rental companies, logistics firms, and private contractors." "Understood." Bruno grabbed his notepad and hurried out. Matthew exhaled slowly, staring at the screen for another moment before grabbing his coat. He needed to visit Rue des Abysses himself. There was something about seeing the scene with his own eyes that always helped him connect the dots. The street looked different in daylight, ordinary, almost peaceful. Tourists wandered in and out of cafes, oblivious to the events of the previous night. Matthew stood at the corner where the van had stopped, visualizing how the abduction had unfolded. His eyes drifted toward a small gallery across the street. La Galerie de Lumière, its window displaying a collection of impressionist reproductions. A thin, bespectacled man stood behind the counter, cleaning a glass case. Matthew crossed the street and stepped inside. The man looked up, startled. "Bonjour, monsieur. Can I help you?" "Inspector Lemoyne, Paris Police," Matthew said, flashing his badge. "I'm investigating an incident that occurred outside last night. Did you happen to see anything unusual around 8 p.m.? The man's brow furrowed. "I close at 7:30 most nights. I was cleaning up and didn't notice much." Matthew nodded. "Do you have security cameras?" The man hesitated. "We do, but they don't cover the street. Just inside the gallery. Mind if I take a look anyway?" The man shrugged and led him to a small office in the back. Matthew leaned over the monitor as the man fast-forwarded through the footage. At first, it seemed irrelevant, just a quiet evening in the gallery. But then, something caught Matthew's attention. At exactly 8:16 p.m., the gallery door opened briefly. A man in a dark coat and cap stepped inside, glanced around for no more than 5 seconds, then left without saying a word. His face was partially obscured, but his actions felt deliberate, as if he was checking something or someone. "Do you recognize him?" Matthew asked. The gallery owner shook his head. "No." He didn't speak, just looked around and left. "May I take a copy of this footage?" "Of course." Matthew left the gallery, his thoughts racing. The man in the footage was unlikely to be a coincidence. He had arrived moments before the abduction, seemingly scouting the area. But what was his role? An accomplice? The mastermind? Or was he merely a witness who had yet to come forward? Elodie's head throbbed as she struggled to regain consciousness. Her vision blurred, the world tilting as she tried to sit up. She was in a dimly lit room, its walls bare concrete, the air damp and stale. The floor beneath her was cold, and the only light came from a single, flickering bulb overhead. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, cutting into her skin each time she moved. Panic surged through her chest, and she forced herself to breathe slowly. Stay calm. Think. The last thing she remembered was the van, the masked figure pulling her inside, the door slamming shut. Now she was here, wherever here was. She scanned the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. In the corner, a metal door stood ajar, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. Faint voices echoed in the distance, too muffled to understand. Her pulse quickened. She knew she had only one chance to escape. The darkness pressed in around Elodie, every sound amplified in the stillness of the concrete room. She strained against the rope binding her wrists, her breath shallow, heart thudding in her chest. The coarse fibers bit into her skin, but she didn't stop. The pain was nothing compared to what could be waiting if she stayed. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help. The faint light flickered, casting fleeting shadows on the floor. Her gaze settled on a rusty nail, barely visible at the base of the wall. Perfect! Elodie shuffled toward it, the cold concrete scraping against her knees. The ropes tightened with each movement, burning her wrists, but she ignored the sting. Inch by inch, she edged closer until her fingers brushed the nail. It was embedded in the wall, stubborn and unyielding. Desperation fueled her strength, and with a sharp tug, it broke free. Clenching the nail between trembling fingers, she began sawing at the rope. Minutes felt like hours, the thin thread of hope her only focus. Her breathing grew ragged, sweat dripping down her temple. Finally, the rope snapped. Her hands were free. Elodie gasped softly, rubbing her raw wrists, then crept toward the door. The voices from earlier had faded, replaced by the distant hum of machinery. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Silence followed. No footsteps. No alarm. Go. Now. She slipped into the corridor, her bare feet whispering against the cold floor. The corridor stretched out before her, lined with heavy metal doors. Most were shut, but one stood partially open, light spilling into the hallway. Elodie pressed herself against the wall and peered inside. A table stood at the center of the room, cluttered with documents and photographs. On the wall was a large map of Paris, red pins marking several locations. Her heart seized as she spotted one of the photographs, a picture of herself taken 2 days earlier at the Musée d'Orsay. They'd been watching her. She scanned the room for clues, but had no time to linger. Whoever had taken her was clearly part of something larger, something calculated and terrifying. She slipped past the doorway and down the corridor, the hum of machinery growing louder. A heavy metal door loomed at the end of the hall, locked with a keypad. Panic welled up. She pressed random numbers, hoping for a miracle. Nothing. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind her, slow and deliberate. They were coming. Her fingers trembled as she punched in more numbers. A loud beep. The lock released with a heavy clump. She shoved the door open and ran, the cold night air hitting her like a slap to the face. She was outside, a back alley lined with overflowing trash bins and dim streetlights. The footsteps were closer now, almost on top of her. Without thinking, she sprinted into the darkness, her lungs burning, bare feet slapping against the wet pavement. Behind her, a voice shouted in French, "Stop! You can't get away!" But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Inspector Matthew Lemoyne leaned over his desk, eyes glued to the enhanced image of the van. The symbol on the side had become clearer, a circle with a serpent biting its own tail, surrounded by what appeared to be ancient script. He frowned, racking his brain for its meaning. It wasn't a company logo or anything commonly seen in Paris. He scribbled a note to have it cross-referenced with historical and esoteric symbols. Something about it felt archaic. "Inspector," Bruno said, stepping into the office with a tablet. "You're going to want to see this." Matthew followed him to the surveillance room, where several officers were huddled around the screen. Bruno pressed play, and the footage from a traffic camera lit up the monitor. The same van appeared, speeding down Boulevard Saint-Michel at 11:32 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the abduction. The camera caught a fleeting glimpse of the driver, a man in his early 40s with a shaved head and cold, unblinking eyes. Bruno paused the footage. Facial recognition picked him up. His name's Francois Caron, ex-military. Dishonorably discharged in 2015 for conduct violations. He's been under investigation for suspected involvement in black market trafficking operations, but nothing's stuck. Matthew crossed his arms. Trafficking what? Artifacts mostly. Some say he's tied to an underground network dealing in rare art and historical pieces. High-end clients, global connections. Matthew's stomach tightened. The symbol on the van, the surveillance, the methodical nature of the abduction. This wasn't random. If Francois Caron was involved, then Elodie's disappearance was part of something much bigger than a simple kidnapping. "We need to find him," Matthew said, grabbing his coat. "Now." Elodie rounded a corner, her breath hitching as she spotted a passing taxi. She threw herself into the street, waving her arms frantically. The driver slammed on the brakes, his eyes wide with shock as she wrenched the door open and collapsed into the back seat. "Help me," she gasped. "Drive. Please." The driver hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the dark street. Then he nodded, pressing the accelerator. As the taxi sped away, Elodie glanced out the rear window. A dark figure stood at the edge of the alley watching. Not running, not chasing, just watching. Her relief was short-lived. She was free for now, but she knew it wasn't over. They wouldn't stop until they had her back. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. "Where to, mademoiselle?" the driver asked, his voice steady but curious. Elodie's mind raced. She couldn't go home, not yet. Whoever had taken her knew too much about her already. There was only one person she could think of who might help. "Prefecture de police," she said, her voice trembling. She leaned back against the seat, clutching her aching wrists. For now, she was safe. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Absolutely. Here's episode 4, packed with suspense, character development, and a deeper unraveling of the conspiracy. This will be the longest and most detailed episode so far, intertwining Elodie's recovery with the ongoing investigation led by Inspector Matthew. Expect growing tension, new allies, and a disturbing discovery. The streets of Paris were a blur outside the taxi window, streetlights casting fleeting patterns of light and shadow across Elodie's face. She fought to steady her breathing, her mind a chaotic whirl of panic and questions. The events of the past few hours felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her wrists throbbed, raw from the ropes that had bound her, and her body trembled from exhaustion and fear. She looked down at herself. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her feet bare and bleeding from the rough pavement. The driver glanced at her again through the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with concern. "You okay, mademoiselle?" he asked gently. "Do I need to take you to a hospital?" Elodie shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. No hospital. Just the prefecture de police. Please." He nodded and pressed the accelerator. Elodie leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights pass by. They had been watching her for days, weeks maybe. The photograph in the dark room was burned into her memory. Someone had gone to great lengths to track her movements, but why? She wasn't rich. She wasn't important. She was just an art conservator. Unless, her mind flicked back to the Degas pastel she had been working on at the museum. The piece had recently resurfaced after being lost for over a century. Could that be connected? Was someone willing to kill or kidnap for it? The taxi slowed as they neared the prefecture de police, the grand building looming ahead. Elodie felt a rush of relief. Help was just within reach. Prefecture de police, 1:13 a.m. Inspector Matthew Lemoyne was in the middle of a phone call with a forensic analyst when the call was interrupted by a knock on his office door. Bruno poked his head in, his expression grim. "Sir, you need to come downstairs. Now." Matthew followed him to the lobby, where a visibly shaken Elodie sat on one of the leather chairs, clutching a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders. Her eyes darted around the room, as if expecting her captors to burst in at any moment. Matthew approached cautiously, crouching to her level. "Mademoiselle, Elodie Durand, correct?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "My name is Inspector Matthew Lemoyne. You're safe now. Can you tell me what happened?" Elodie looked at him, her eyes wide and unblinking. For a moment, she said nothing, as if struggling to process the question. Finally, she nodded. "I was taken," she said, her voice barely audible. "They grabbed me off the street, forced me into a van. I don't know where they took me. It was some kind of warehouse or basement. There were other rooms, a map, pictures of me." Matthew's stomach sank. This confirmed his growing suspicion. This was no random crime. "Pictures of you?" Elodie nodded again. "One of them, it was from 2 days ago, outside the museum where I work. Someone's been following me." Matthew exchanged a glance with Bruno. This wasn't a coincidence. The surveillance, the targeted nature of the abduction. Someone had been planning this for a while. "Did you hear anything while you were being held? Names? Locations? Anything that might help us find these people?" Elodie closed her eyes, trying to remember. "I heard voices, 2 men talking about a delivery. One of them mentioned something about the auction. They said it was happening in 3 days. That's all I heard before I escaped." "The auction," Matthew repeated. "Did they say where?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "But they sounded nervous, like they were running out of time." Matthew's office, 2:30 a.m. Matthew leaned back in his chair, staring at the board in front of him. A map of Paris was pinned to it, marked with red dots indicating recent crimes, primarily thefts from private collections and high-end galleries. The auction. He couldn't ignore the connection to Francois Caron and the symbol on the van. If Elodie's abduction was related to the black market art trade, then the auction was the key. But without a location, they were shooting in the dark. Bruno entered, holding a file. "I ran a search on known underground auction networks. One name keeps coming up, La Chambre Noire, the Black Chamber. It's a secretive group that specializes in selling stolen art and rare artifacts. Highly organized, dangerous. According to Interpol, they've been active in France, Spain, and Italy for years, but no one's been able to infiltrate them." Matthew frowned. "Do we have any idea where they operate?" Bruno shook his head. "No confirmed locations. They change venues constantly, warehouses, abandoned mansions, private yachts. Always different, always untraceable." Matthew tapped the map, deep in thought. "If this auction is happening in 3 days, they'll be preparing the location now. Increase surveillance on Francois Caron and anyone associated with him. If we find him, we find the auction." Elodie's apartment, 3:45 a.m. Elodie sat on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping the tea that Matthew had insisted she drink. He had driven her home himself, insisting on checking the apartment before she went inside. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" he asked, standing in the doorway. Elodie nodded. "I'll lock everything. Thank you, Inspector. If you remember anything else, call me immediately." And don't leave the apartment unless absolutely necessary. As Matthew walked away, Elodie locked the door behind him, sliding the deadbolt into place. She leaned against the door, closing her eyes. But peace didn't come. Her mind kept replaying the image of the map in the dark room, the red pins scattered across Paris. What if they came back? What if this wasn't over? Her eyes flicked to her phone on the coffee table. She had to tell someone else, someone she trusted. There was one person who might know more about what she'd seen. Claire Fournier, her colleague at the museum. She grabbed her phone and dialed. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. Elodie, do you have any idea what time it is? Claire, Elodie said, her voice trembling. I need your help. Something's happened, and I think it has to do with the Degas pastel. The first rays of dawn spilled through the narrow streets of Paris, bathing the city in pale light. Elodie sat at her kitchen table, her phone clutched in her hand, eyes fixed on the floor as she waited for Claire to arrive. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards set her nerves on edge. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The tea she had made sat untouched, long gone cold. Her mind raced through the events of the night, the dark basement, the photograph, the mention of the auction. Then there was the Degas pastel. Had it been the reason she was taken? Was something hidden in it that she had missed? A soft knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She rushed to the peephole. It was Claire, her best friend and colleague at the museum. Elodie unlocked the door and pulled her inside. Claire, dressed in a rumpled coat, her dark hair tied in a messy bun, looked at her with concern. Elodie, what's going on? You sounded terrified on the phone. What happened? Elodie closed the door, locking it behind her. It's not safe to talk here. I need to show you something. She led Claire into the living room, her voice low and urgent. I was kidnapped last night. They took me to some kind of warehouse, but I escaped. While I was there, I saw a map of Paris with red pins marking locations, and photos of me, taken near the museum. I think it has something to do with the Degas piece I've been working on. Claire's eyes widened. Wait, kidnapped? Elodie, you should be in a hospital. We need to. There's no time, Elodie interrupted. I heard them talking about an auction. It's happening in 3 days. Whoever took me, they were after something. Claire sank onto the couch, processing everything. The Degas, she said slowly. There was something strange about it. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when it was delivered, the frame seemed unusually heavy for a pastel. Elodie frowned. Heavy how? I don't know. I assumed it was just reinforced to protect it, but maybe there's something hidden inside. Elodie's pulse quickened. If there was something hidden in the Degas, it could explain everything. We need to get back to the museum, she said. I have to check that frame. Claire hesitated. The museum doesn't open for hours, and the security system will still be active. Breaking in isn't exactly an option. Then we'll wait until it opens, Elodie said. We'll go in early and check the Degas before anyone else gets there. Prefecture de Police, 7:15 a.m. Inspector Matthews stood in the surveillance room, watching the footage from the security cameras near Elodie's apartment. He had spent the last few hours trying to piece together the puzzle, but every new piece only raised more questions. Francois Caron was still their best lead, but he had vanished without a trace after the van had been spotted on Boulevard Saint-Michel. His known associates were being monitored, but so far there was no sign of activity. Bruno entered, holding a cup of coffee. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. Sir, I cross-referenced the symbol on the van with Interpol's database. It matches an old esoteric group, La Serpentine, known for smuggling rare artifacts. They disappeared years ago, but it seems they've resurfaced under a different name. La Chambre Noire, Matthew muttered. Bruno nodded. It's possible. If they're behind this, the auction could be their biggest operation yet. Matthew rubbed his temples. We're running out of time. I want every available unit on this. Increase surveillance on the museum. If this is about the Degas pastel, it might be the key to everything. Musée d'Orsay, 8:30 a.m. Elodie and Claire arrived at the museum, just as the first staff members were unlocking the doors. They slipped inside, keeping their heads down, and made their way to the conservation lab. The Degas pastel sat on a work table, its muted colors glowing softly in the morning light. Elodie's hands trembled as she reached for it, carefully turning it over to inspect the frame. Claire stood beside her, holding a small set of tools. If there's something hidden inside, it would be behind the backing board. Elodie nodded and began unscrewing the frame. The process was slow, each turn of the screwdriver heightening the tension in the room. Finally, the last screw came free, and she gently pried off the backing board. Her breath caught in her throat. There was something there. A thin compartment had been carved into the frame, hidden behind the backing. Inside was a rolled-up piece of parchment, yellowed with age. Elodie carefully unrolled it, revealing a series of strange symbols and cryptic writing. Claire leaned in, her eyes wide. "Well, what is that?" "I don't know," Elodie whispered. The parchment looked ancient, the ink faded but still legible. At the center of the document was the same symbol she had seen on the van, the circle with the serpent biting its own tail. "It's a cipher," Claire said, running her fingers over the symbols. "A code, but it's not in any language I recognize." Elodie's mind raced. This wasn't just an art heist. This was something far bigger, something connected to history, to secrets long buried. "We need to get this to Inspector Lemoyne," she said, rolling up the parchment. "He'll know what to do." Claire nodded. "But be careful. If someone was willing to kidnap you for this, they won't stop now." Outside the museum, 9 a.m. Elodie and Claire stepped out into the street, the parchment safely tucked inside Elodie's bag. The morning rush was in full swing, and the sidewalks were crowded with tourists and commuters. But something felt wrong. Elodie glanced over her shoulder, her pulse quickening. A man in a dark coat stood at the corner, watching them. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Her grip on her bag tightened. They were being followed. "Claire," she said quietly, "we need to get to the police station. Now." They pushed through the crowd, their pace quickening with every step. Behind them, the man began to follow, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Elodie's heart pounded in her chest. They were so close to safety, just a few more blocks. Then the man raised his phone to his ear. Moments later, 2 more men appeared from a side street, blocking their path. Elodie froze. They were surrounded. The street outside the museum buzzed with morning life, bustling tourists, shopkeepers opening their doors, and Parisians rushing to work. But for Elodie and Claire, it had transformed into a trap. The 2 men standing ahead of them weren't ordinary passers-by. Their eyes locked on Elodie, their expressions calm yet unnervingly focused. Behind her, the man in the dark coat continued his steady pursuit. They were boxed in. "Elodie," Claire whispered, gripping her arm tightly. "What do we do?" Elodie's mind raced. There was no time to call the police, no time to think. They had to act now, or they wouldn't have another chance. "Follow me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Without waiting for a response, Elodie darted to her left, weaving through the crowd. Claire followed closely, her heart pounding in her chest. The men hesitated for a split second, then sprang into action, pushing through the crowd in pursuit. The chase. Elodie and Claire sprinted down Rue de Lille, dodging startled pedestrians and narrowly avoiding colliding with a delivery cyclist. Every footstep echoed in Elodie's ears, every glance over her shoulder confirming the men were still behind them, relentless, gaining ground with each second. "Turn here," Elodie gasped, pulling Claire into a narrow alleyway. They ducked into a side street lined with overflowing trash bins and weathered stone walls. Claire doubled over, panting. "Are we clear?" Elodie shook her head, peeking around the corner. One of the men had stopped at the entrance to the alley, scanning the area. His eyes swept past them once, then returned, locking onto their hiding spot. "Run!" Elodie shouted, grabbing Claire's hand. The 2 women tore through the alley, their footsteps splashing through puddles from last night's rain. The alley opened onto a broader street near the Seine River, where rows of bookstalls lined the embankment. Elodie's eyes darted toward the river. The water. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. "This way!" she yelled, pulling Claire toward the riverbank. Behind them, the footsteps grew louder. The men weren't far, perhaps 20 meters back. "Jump!" Elodie cried, leaping down a set of stone steps that led directly to the river's edge. The water glistened in the early light, the current slow but steady. Elodie turned toward Claire, her chest heaving. "We can hide under the bridge," she said. "It'll give us a chance to lose them." They scrambled beneath the Pont des Arts, crouching in the shadows as the footsteps thundered above them. For a moment, there was only silence. Elodie held her breath, straining to hear any sound that might betray their pursuer's location. Moments of fear. Claire wiped sweat from her brow, her hands trembling. "Elodie, who are these people? What do they want?" Elodie clutched the bag containing the ancient parchment. "It's connected to the Degas pastel, I'm sure of it. That symbol, the serpent, it must be more than a mark of ownership. This document, it's a cipher or a map. They want whatever it leads to." Claire's eyes widened. A map? To what? I don't know, Elodie admitted, but it must be something valuable enough to kill for. Above them, the footsteps stopped. Elodie dared to peek out from their hiding place. The two men stood at the top of the steps, speaking rapidly into their phones. They weren't giving up. We can't stay here, Elodie whispered. We need to find Inspector Lemoyne. Claire nodded. There's a police station 2 blocks from here. If we can make it there. Suddenly, one of the men pointed in their direction. He barked something into his phone, then started down the steps toward the river. Elodie's heart leapt into her throat. Move. Now. A desperate escape. They bolted from beneath the bridge, running along the riverbank. The cobblestone path was slippery, but adrenaline kept them upright. The Seine sparkled to their right, the morning sun reflecting off the water like liquid fire. The men were close, too close. Elodie could hear their rapid footsteps just behind her. Then she saw it. A bateau mouche tourist boat preparing to depart from a nearby dock. Its engine rumbled as passengers filed on board, cameras in hand. Come on, Elodie yelled, veering toward the dock. Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second before following. They pushed through the line of tourists, ignoring the startled shouts and protests, and leapt onto the boat just as it pulled away from the dock. The men skidded to a halt at the edge of the dock, their frustration evident. One of them raised his phone again, speaking urgently. Elodie and Claire collapsed onto a bench, gasping for breath. Around them, tourists snapped photos of the riverbanks, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. Claire looked at Elodie, her face pale. We can't keep running like this. They'll find us again. I know, Elodie said, but at least we bought ourselves some time. We need to get to the police, and we need to figure out what this parchment means. Prefecture de Police, 11:45 a.m. Inspector Matthew paced his office, his phone pressed to his ear. No, I don't care how secretive they are. If La Chambre Noire is planning an auction, we need to know where and when immediately. Bruno entered, holding a laptop. Sir, you're going to want to see this. Surveillance footage from near the museum this morning. Matthew leaned over the desk as Bruno played the footage. His jaw tightened as he watched Elodie and Claire sprinting down the street, pursued by 2 men. Who are they? Matthew asked. Still working on that, Bruno said. But they're not amateurs. The way they moved, organized, disciplined. They're professionals. Matthew's eyes narrowed. Elodie was in danger, and these men wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Find them, he ordered, and put a protective detail on Elodie Durand. She's the key to this whole operation. The Seine glimmered in the late morning sun as the tourist boat made its way down the river. On board, Elodie and Claire sat in silence, the weight of their discovery settling in. Around them, tourists snapped photos of Paris landmarks, blissfully unaware of the life-or-death chase that had just taken place. Elodie clutched her bag, the ancient parchment still tucked safely inside. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. The symbols, the serpent emblem, and the hidden compartment in the Degas pastel. All of it pointed to something far bigger than an art heist. But what? We need help, Claire said, breaking the silence. We can't decipher this on our own. Elodie nodded. There's someone who might be able to help. Professor Gabriel Moreau. He's an expert in cryptology and ancient languages. He used to lecture at the Sorbonne, but now he works independently. Claire frowned. You trust him? I don't know, Elodie admitted. But he's the best chance we've got. The meeting with Professor Moreau. An hour later, Elodie and Claire arrived at a modest townhouse in the 5th arrondissement. The shutters were closed, and ivy crept up the stone walls. Elodie knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a long pause, it opened a crack, revealing an older man with sharp features and intense blue eyes. His silver hair was disheveled, and he wore a faded sweater over a collared shirt. Elodie Durand, he said, his voice tinged with surprise. It's been a long time. Professor Moreau, Elodie said, forcing a smile. I'm sorry to show up unannounced, but I need your help. It's urgent. Moreau studied her for a moment, then opened the door wider. Come in. Inside, the townhouse was cluttered with books and papers. Ancient texts were piled on every available surface, alongside maps, old manuscripts, and strange artifacts from around the world. Elodie placed the parchment on the table. I found this hidden inside the frame of a Degas pastel. I think it's a cipher, but I don't recognize the symbols. Moreau leaned over the parchment, his eyes narrowing as he examined the faded ink and intricate markings. This is remarkable, he muttered. These symbols aren't from a single language. It's a hybrid cipher, part Latin, part Hebrew, and part something much older. Whoever created this wanted to ensure only a select few could read it. Can you decipher it? Claire asked. Moreau nodded slowly. I'll need some time, but if I'm right, this could be part of a Templar cipher, a code used by the Knights Templar to protect their most valuable secrets. The Knights Templar? Claire echoed, disbelief creeping into her voice. You're saying this is connected to some ancient order? It's possible, Moreau said. But if it is, we're dealing with something far more dangerous than stolen art. The Templar ciphers often led to hidden caches of knowledge or artifacts, things people would kill to possess. A chill ran down Elodie's spine. The auction. It wasn't about selling stolen paintings. It was about something much bigger. Moreau glanced at the window, his expression turning grave. You said you were followed. If they know you have this parchment, you're in serious danger. You can stay here while I work on the translation. Lock the doors and don't let anyone in. Prefecture de Police, 3 p.m. Inspector Matthew sat at his desk, poring over a file marked classified. The name La Chamber Moore had appeared in old police records, tied to a string of art thefts and disappearances across Europe. The group had operated in the shadows for decades before vanishing without a trace. Now they were back. Bruno entered, his face grim. Sir, we've identified one of the men who was chasing Elodie Duran this morning. His name is Viktor Resnick, a former operative with the Russian FSB. He went rogue 5 years ago and has been working as a mercenary ever since. A mercenary? Matthew leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Why would a mercenary be chasing an art conservator? Bruno nodded. It gets worse. Resnick is known to work for high-paying clients involved in the black market, rare artifacts, stolen art, ancient manuscripts. If he's after Elodie, it's not just about money. He's after something priceless. Matthew's phone buzzed. It was an update from the surveillance team near the museum. Sir, we've tracked Elodie and Claire to the home of Professor Gabriel Moreau, the officer reported. We've also spotted 2 unidentified men watching the house. Matthew shot to his feet. Keep eyes on them, but don't move in yet. I'm on my way. Danger at the townhouse. Inside Moreau's study, the tension was palpable. The professor worked tirelessly, his fingers flying across the parchment as he jotted down notes and cross-referenced symbols with his ancient texts. Elodie paced the room, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. Claire sat by the window, peeking through the curtains. I don't like this, Claire said. There's a black car parked across the street. It's been there for the past 20 minutes. Elodie's stomach nodded. They found us. Moreau glanced up, his expression calm but serious. If they found you, we need to leave now. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house. The front door rattled on its hinges as someone tried to force it open. They're here, Claire cried. Upstairs, Moreau shouted. There's a back exit through the roof. Go! Elodie grabbed the parchment and bolted for the stairs, Claire close behind. Moreau followed, locking the door behind them. The 3 of them climbed to the top floor, where a narrow window led to the roof. Elodie clambered through first, her heart pounding as she stepped onto the slate tiles. Claire followed, but as Moreau began to climb out, the door below shattered. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. Hurry, Elodie urged. Moreau squeezed through the window, just as the attackers burst into the room below. He glanced down at the street, then pointed toward an adjacent rooftop. We have to jump, he said. Elodie's pulse quickened. The gap between the buildings was at least 2 meters. One wrong move, and they'd plummet to the street below. Claire hesitated, her face pale. Are you serious? There's no time to debate. Moreau snapped. They're coming. Without another word, Elodie took a deep breath and jumped. She landed hard on the other roof, rolling to absorb the impact. Come on, she called. Claire followed, barely making the jump. Moreau was last, his movements surprisingly agile for his age. Behind them, the attackers emerged onto the roof, guns drawn. Elodie didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran, weaving across the rooftops until they reached a fire escape that led down to a narrow alley. They climbed down, hearts racing, and disappeared into the maze of back streets. Night had fallen over Paris, casting a silvery glow over the rooftops as Elodie, Claire, and Professor Moreau huddled inside an old bookshop near the Latin Quarter. The shop belonged to one of Moreau's trusted friends, an antiquarian named Etienne Laurent, who had closed early to give them a safe place to regroup. Bookshelves towered around them, the air thick with the scent of ancient parchment and worn leather. Candles flickered on the table as Moreau unrolled the cryptic document once again. adjusting his glasses. We don't have much time, Moreau said, his voice low. Whoever those men are, they won't stop until they have this. Elodie leaned forward. What have you found? Moreau tapped his finger on the parchment. This is definitely a Templar cipher, but it's more than just a message. It's a layered code, designed to conceal multiple secrets within the same document. I've managed to translate part of it. He grabbed a notebook and read aloud. The serpent guards the path to the last treasure of Montsegur. Beware the shadow of the betrayed. Claire frowned. Montsegur? What's that? A fortress in the south of France, Moreau explained. It was the last stronghold of the Cathars, a religious sect that was wiped out in the 13th century. Legend has it that some of the survivors escaped with a great treasure, gold, manuscripts, and ancient relics. Over the centuries, many believed it was hidden beneath Montsegur. Elodie's eyes widened. And you think this cipher points to that treasure? It's possible, Moreau said, but the reference to the serpent worries me. It could be a metaphor, or it could be something far more dangerous. A growing threat. Meanwhile, across the city, Inspector Matthew stood in front of a large board covered with photos, maps, and documents related to La Chambre Noire. His team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing names and tracking down leads. Bruno entered the room, holding a tablet. Sir, we've intercepted a message on the dark web. There's an encrypted auction scheduled for tomorrow night. It's invitation only, but we traced the server back to a known La Chambre Noire operation. Matthew's jaw tightened. What are they selling? We don't know yet, Bruno said, but given the security around it, it's something big. Matthew's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, an anonymous text message. You're running out of time. Watch your back. Not everyone is on your side. His stomach churned. He had suspected for a while that someone inside the police force was leaking information to La Chambre Noire. But who? He turned back to Bruno. Get a team ready. We're shutting this auction down, decoding the past. Back at the bookshop, Moreau continued to work on the cipher while Elodie and Claire paced nervously. Etienne entered the room, carrying a tray of coffee. I've bolted the doors and windows, he said. We should be safe for now. Elodie forced a smile. Thank you, Etienne. I don't know what we would have done without you. The old man chuckled. I've always loved a good mystery. But this one feels different. Moreau suddenly sat up straight, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I've got it! What? Claire asked, rushing to his side. There's another layer to the code, a hidden map, Moreau said, pointing to a series of faint symbols that had appeared under the candlelight. This shows the location of a hidden chamber beneath Montsegur. A hidden chamber? Elodie repeated. Yes, Moreau said. If the legends are true, it could contain ancient manuscripts or relics that the Cathars were desperate to protect from the Inquisition. Claire leaned closer, her pulse quickening. So the treasure might not be gold, it might be knowledge. Exactly, Moreau said. Knowledge that could rewrite history. A betrayal unveiled. As they planned their next move, footsteps echoed outside the bookshop. Etienne froze, his hand tightening around the tray. Someone's out there, he whispered. Moreau extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. Elodie peeked through the curtain. A man in a dark coat stood across the street, speaking into a phone. It's one of them, she said, her voice barely audible. Suddenly, the door burst open, and two armed men stormed inside. Get down, Moreau shouted, flipping the table for cover. Elodie and Claire dug behind the table as gunfire erupted, shattering glass and sending books flying. Etienne pulled a small pistol from beneath the counter and fired back, forcing the intruders to take cover. Elodie, run! Moreau yelled. Elodie grabbed the parchment and scrambled toward the back exit, Claire right behind her. Etienne and Moreau held off the attackers, buying them precious seconds. They burst into the alley, the cold night air stinging their faces. Elodie's heart pounded as they sprinted through the labyrinthine streets, shadows stretching like claws around every corner. We can't keep running, Claire gasped. We need to call Inspector Matthew. Elodie nodded, pulling out her phone. If they didn't get help soon, they wouldn't survive the night. Prefecture de Police, 11:45 p.m. Matthew's phone rang. He answered immediately, recognizing Elodie's number. Elodie, where are you? We're in the Latin Quarter, she said, her voice trembling. They found us at the bookshop. We barely escaped. Stay where you are, Matthew said. I'm sending a team to get you. No, Elodie said. We can't stay in one place. They'll find us. We're heading south to Montsegur. The answer is there. Matthew hesitated. It's too dangerous. You don't know what you're walking into. I don't have a choice, Elodie said. They won't stop until they get this parchment. If we can find the hidden chamber first, we'll have the leverage we need to stop them. Matthew sighed. All right, I'll meet you there. But be careful, La Chamber Noir has eyes everywhere. The Pyrenees loomed on the horizon like jagged teeth, their snow-dusted peaks glowing in the pale light of dawn. Elodie tightened her coat as the wind whipped across the desolate landscape. It had been an exhausting 6-hour drive from Paris, but Montségur was finally within reach. Perched atop a steep hill, the fortress ruins seemed to watch over the valley below like a silent sentinel from the past. Broken stone walls jutted into the sky, remnants of a time long forgotten. The air was heavy with history, and something darker, something almost palpable. Elodie glanced at Claire and Moreau. We're here, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Claire wrapped her arms around herself. It feels ominous. It is, Moreau said, his gaze fixed on the crumbling structure. In 1244, over 200 Cathar believers were burned alive here for refusing to renounce their faith. Legend says some of them carried their most precious relics into the hidden chamber below the fortress before the siege ended. And you think that's where the cipher is leading us? Claire asked. Moreau nodded. If the map is accurate, yes. But finding the entrance won't be easy. They began the steep ascent, winding their way up the rocky path toward the ruins. The wind howled around them, carrying whispers of the past. Every step felt heavier, as if the fortress itself were reluctant to give up its secrets. A hidden entrance. The ruins were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Elodie scanned the ancient stone walls, searching for any sign of the hidden chamber. The parchment symbols had hinted at a specific location, a place marked by the serpent. Moreau examined the carved symbols on one of the walls. There, he said, pointing to a faded engraving, a coiled serpent with a key in its mouth. That's the mark. Claire ran her fingers over the engraving. But how do we get in? Moreau traced the lines of the serpent with his hand, pressing against the wall. After a moment, there was a faint click, and a hidden door swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. A narrow staircase spiraled downward into darkness. Elodie swallowed hard. I guess we're going in. Moreau lit a flashlight, and they descended into the depths of the fortress. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of damp stone and earth filling their nostrils. The walls were lined with carvings, symbols and texts in an ancient language that even Moreau couldn't immediately identify. This is incredible, he whispered. These carvings could be over 800 years old. Claire shivered. Let's just find what we're looking for and get out of here. The Chamber of Secrets. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a large, domed chamber. The air was thick and stale, and their footsteps echoed eerily in the cavernous space. Stone pillars rose from the floor, their surfaces covered in intricate carvings. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, and on it lay an ancient chest, its surface adorned with symbols similar to those on the parchment. Elodie's heart raced as she approached the chest. This must be it. Moreau stepped beside her, running his fingers over the carvings. It's a reliquary, a container used to hold sacred objects. Be careful. It might be trapped. Claire raised an eyebrow. Trapped? Like Indiana Jones? Exactly, Moreau said, not a trace of humor in his voice. He carefully examined the chest, then nodded. It's safe. Open it. Elodie hesitated for a moment, then lifted the lid. Inside were several ancient scrolls, their parchment yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved. Alongside them lay a small, intricately carved key. Moreau's eyes lit up. These scrolls could contain knowledge lost for centuries, histories, prophecies, maybe even maps to other hidden sites. Claire picked up the key, holding it up to the light. And this? What does it open? Before Moreau could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed from the staircase. They're here, Elodie whispered. The arrival of La Chamber Noir. Several figures emerged from the darkness, four men in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. The leader, a tall man with cold eyes, stepped forward, his gun trained on them. Well done, he said in a thick Eastern European accent. We knew you would lead us to the chamber eventually. Elodie clenched her fists. Who are you? The less you know, the longer you might live, the man said with a smirk. Now, hand over the scrolls and the key. Run, Moreau shouted, grabbing the chest and shoving it into Elodie's arms. Claire and Elodie bolted for the far end of the chamber, weaving between the pillars as gunfire erupted around them. Stone fragments rained down as bullets struck the ancient walls. Moreau ducked behind a pillar, returning fire with a small pistol he had tucked into his coat. "Go! I'll hold them off." "No!" Elodie cried. "We're not leaving you." Moreau shot her a determined look. "You have to. If they get those scrolls, everything will be lost." Tears stung Elodie's eyes, but she knew he was right. Grabbing Claire's hand, she sprinted toward a narrow passage at the far end of the chamber. The escape. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the mountain. The sound of gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic drip of water echoing through the tunnels. Claire stumbled, gasping for breath. "We can't keep running like this forever." Elodie glanced back, her heart hammering in her chest. "We're almost there. Just a little farther." The passage finally opened into a large cavern with a small opening at the top. Moonlight filtered through, illuminating a rickety ladder that led to the surface. Elodie climbed first, her muscles burning with the effort. She reached the top and pulled herself onto the grass, then helped Claire up. They lay on the ground, gasping for air, the cold night air stinging their lungs. "We made it," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Elodie sat up, clutching the chest. But at what cost? The night wrapped around them like a cloak as Elodie and Claire raced through the dense forests surrounding Montsegur. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and their breath came in ragged gasps as they climbed higher into the hills, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and La Chambre Noire. Claire clutched the ancient chest tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. "Where do we go now?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. Elodie paused, glancing around. The landscape stretched into darkness, the distant lights of a small village twinkling below. "We can't head back to the main road, they'll be watching it. We need to find somewhere safe to hide and figure out what these scrolls say." Claire nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. "And Moreau?" Elodie's jaw tightened. "He'll find a way. He always does." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. A hidden haven. They stumbled upon an old shepherd's hut tucked into a hollow beneath the trees. The roof sagged, and ivy clung to the crumbling stone walls, but it was shelter. Elodie pushed open the heavy wooden door, and they slipped inside. The interior was dark and musty, but a small fireplace and a stack of wood suggested someone had been there recently. Elodie lit a fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the rough stone walls. Claire set the chest on a rickety table and opened it carefully. The scrolls inside glowed faintly in the firelight, their ancient symbols almost alive on the parchment. Elodie leaned closer, her heart quickening. "We need to decode these." Claire frowned. "Do you think they contain a map to more hidden chambers?" "Maybe," Elodie said, running her fingers over the delicate writing. "But there's something else. Look at the way these symbols are arranged. It's not just a map. It's a story." Claire squinted at the scroll. "A story?" Elodie nodded. "A story that was hidden for centuries. If we can decipher it, we'll understand why La Chambre Noire is so desperate to get their hands on it." They worked late into the night, using Moreau's notes and the cipher they had already cracked. Piece by piece, the story began to emerge, a tale of an ancient society, the Guardians of the Light, sworn to protect a powerful secret. The story of the Guardians. The scrolls told of a hidden relic, one that held the key to the light of truth. According to the ancient text, the relic was not a weapon or a treasure, but a source of knowledge so powerful it could change the course of history. It had been passed down through generations of guardians, hidden away after the fall of Montsegur to protect it from those who sought to exploit its power. Elodie's hands trembled as she read the final lines. It's not just a legend. The Guardians existed, and they entrusted this knowledge to the Cathars before they were destroyed. Claire's eyes widened. And now La Chambre Noire wants it. If they get their hands on this, they could rewrite history, Elodie finished, or destroy it entirely. Inspector Matthew's investigation. The sun was just beginning to rise when Inspector Matthew arrived at Montsegur. His car bumped along the narrow road leading to the fortress, his mind racing. The call from Elodie had left him deeply unsettled. She had always been strong and resourceful, but the desperation in her voice told him she was in deeper trouble than ever before. He parked near the ruins and made his way up the hill. A team of local police officers was already on the scene, cordoning off the area where the gunfight had taken place. Matthew approached one of the officers, a young man with dark circles under his eyes. "What do we have?" "2 bodies, the officer said. "No IDs. Both shot multiple times." Matthew's stomach tightened. "And the others?" "Gone," the officer said. "We found traces of blood leading down into the forest, but no sign of where they went." Matthew clenched his fists. Elodie, Claire, Moreau. He refused to believe they were among the dead. Bruno appeared at his side, holding a tablet. "We've got something, sir." Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. Elodie and Claire were spotted about 2 hours ago heading south. "Where were they going?" Matthew asked. Bruno shook his head. "We're still working on that. But there's something else. You're not going to like it." He handed Matthew the tablet. The screen displayed a series of intercepted messages, encrypted communications between La Chambre Noire operatives. One name kept appearing, Agent Noir. Matthew's blood ran cold. Agent Noir was a code name for a high-ranking mole inside the police force. Someone he had worked with, trusted. "Whoever this is," Bruno said, "they've been feeding La Chambre Noire information for months." Matthew cursed under his breath. "We need to find out who it is. Fast." Betrayal and revelation. Back at the shepherd's hut, Elodie and Claire were still poring over the scrolls when they heard a noise outside. A twig snapping, the rustle of leaves. Elodie grabbed the pistol Moreau had given her and crept toward the window. Peering through the cracked glass, she saw a figure moving through the trees, his face obscured by the shadows. "It's them," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Elodie's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. Not with the scrolls. "Out the back," she said. "Hurry." They slipped out the back door, moving silently through the forest. The figure followed, his footsteps growing louder with each passing second. They reached a clearing and stopped, breathless. The figure stepped into the light, a man in his late 40s with sharp features and cold eyes. "Well done," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You've led me right to it." Elodie raised the pistol, her hand steady. "Who are you?" "A friend," the man said mockingly. "Or at least I was, until you made things complicated." It dawned on her then. He was Agent Noir, the mole inside the police force. "You won't get the scrolls," Elodie said, her voice firm. The man laughed. "Oh, but I already have." He gestured behind him, and 2 more figures stepped out of the shadows, their weapons drawn. Claire tightened her grip on the chest. "Now what?" Elodie's mind raced. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they still had one advantage, the key. "Run," she whispered, "and don't look back." Claire hesitated for a split second, then turned and sprinted into the forest. Elodie fired a warning shot, buying her a few precious seconds before following. The chase was on. The forest was alive with sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and footsteps pounding through the underbrush. Elodie sprinted, her breath coming in short gasps, her pulse thundering in her ears. Claire was a few steps ahead, clutching the ancient chest tightly, refusing to let go despite its weight. Behind them, the shadowy figures of their pursuers closed in, their voices cutting through the night like knives. "They're gaining on us," Claire shouted, her voice strained with panic. Elodie glanced over her shoulder. The men from La Chambre Noire moved with ruthless efficiency, their black clothing blending into the darkness. They carried weapons, silent and deadly. "We need to split up," Elodie yelled. "Head toward the river. I'll meet you at the bridge." Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Be careful." Without another word, she veered to the right, disappearing into the shadows. Elodie kept running straight, her mind racing. She had to buy Claire time. If they got the scrolls, everything they had worked for would be lost. The trap! Elodie burst into a clearing, her boots skidding on the damp ground. A crumbling stone archway stood at the edge of the clearing, a relic from another time. Vines curled around its base, and ancient symbols were etched into the weathered stones. She barely had time to register its significance before the first man emerged from the trees, his gun raised. "Stop!" he barked. Elodie raised her hands, her heart pounding. She couldn't afford to be captured. Not now. The man approached slowly, his eyes cold and calculating. "You've caused us a lot of trouble, you know. But it ends here. Hand over the key." Elodie took a step back, her fingers brushing against the cold stone of the archway. She could feel the ancient symbols beneath her fingertips, symbols she had seen on the scrolls. A spark of recognition flashed in her mind. The archway wasn't just a relic. It was a gateway, an entrance to something hidden. She made a decision in an instant. "Come and get it," she said, then turned and sprinted through the archway. The man hesitated for a moment, then followed. The hidden passage. Elodie's feet struck stone steps as she descended into darkness. The air grew colder, the walls narrowing around her. She pulled out her flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom, revealing a winding passageway carved deep into the earth. Her heart raced. This was the place Moreau had spoken of, the forgotten path. a hidden network of tunnels used by the Cathars to escape during the siege of Montsegur. The passage twisted and turned, the walls lined with ancient carvings. She could hear the man's footsteps behind her, growing louder with every step. But she knew these tunnels were a labyrinth. If she could stay ahead of him, she had a chance. Claire's desperate flight. Meanwhile, Claire reached the river, her breath ragged. The water rushed past her, cold and fast-moving. She looked around, searching for the bridge Elodie had mentioned. There it was, a narrow stone bridge, half hidden by overgrown foliage. She sprinted toward it, her heart leaping with hope. But as she reached the middle of the bridge, a figure stepped into her path. It was the man from before, the one who had called himself Agent Noir. His face was calm, almost amused, as he raised his weapon. "Well, well," he said. "You've led us on quite the chase." Claire's hands tightened around the chest. "You'll have to kill me to get this." Agent Noir chuckled. "Oh, I don't need to kill you. Not yet, but you will hand it over, or I'll make sure your friend pays the price." Claire's mind raced. She couldn't let them take the scrolls, but she also couldn't leave Elodie to face them alone. "Tick-tock," Agent Noir said, taking a step closer. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the night. Agent Noir spun around, clutching his shoulder. Claire looked up to see Inspector Matthew standing at the edge of the bridge, his gun still raised. "Step away from her," Matthew said, his voice deadly calm. Agent Noir smirked despite the pain. "Ah, Inspector. Always arriving just in time to complicate things." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Drop the weapon. Now." For a moment, it seemed Agent Noir might comply. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, he leapt off the side of the bridge, disappearing into the river below. Matthew rushed to the edge, but the current had already swept him away. "Damn it!" Matthew cursed. A temporary victory. Claire collapsed onto the bridge, her whole body trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Matthew knelt beside her, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. "Where's Elodie?" Claire pointed toward the hills. "She went that way, into the tunnels." Matthew's face darkened. "We need to find her. Those tunnels are dangerous, and they're not the only ones down there." He helped Claire to her feet, and together they set off toward the ancient archway. Deep in the labyrinth, Elodie pressed on, the passageway growing narrower with every step. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She could hear the man behind her, his footsteps relentless. Suddenly, the passage opened into a large cavern. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, and a pool of dark water glimmered in the center. At the far end of the cavern was a stone door, its surface covered in ancient symbols. Elodie ran toward it, her fingers brushing against the carvings. The key! She needed the key. Her heart sank. Claire had the key. The man stepped into the cavern, his gun aimed at her. "End of the line," he said. Elodie raised her hands, stalling for time. "You don't know what's behind that door. If you open it, you might unleash something you can't control." The man smirked. "Nice try, but I'm not interested in fairy tales." Before he could take another step, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. The symbols on the door glowed faintly, the air crackling with energy. Elodie's eyes widened. Something was waking up. The man hesitated, sensing the change in the air. "What the hell is this?" The trembling grew stronger, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. Elodie seized her chance. She turned and sprinted back toward the passageway, the cavern collapsing behind her. A narrow escape. Elodie burst out of the tunnel, just as the ground gave way behind her. She collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. Claire and Matthew were waiting for her, their faces filled with relief. "Elodie!" Claire cried, running to her side. Elodie looked up at her, a tired smile on her face. "We have to keep moving. This isn't over." Matthew nodded grimly. "You're right. La Chambre Noire won't stop until they have what they're after. But now we know what we're dealing with. And we have something they don't." "The key," Elodie said, her eyes locking with Claire's. "It's the only way to unlock the door." Claire held up the ancient key, its surface gleaming in the early morning light. "So what do we do now?" she asked. Elodie stood, determination burning in her eyes. "We find out what's behind that door, and we stop them, once and for all." The early morning sun stretched across the rugged landscape of the Pyrenees, casting long shadows over jagged peaks and valleys shrouded in mist. Elodie leaned against the window of Matthew's car, her eyes scanning the distant horizon. Every muscle in her body ached from the night's ordeal, but there was no time for rest. Claire sat beside her, the ancient chest resting on her lap, its weight both literal and symbolic. Inside it lay secrets that had been buried for centuries, secrets that people were willing to kill for. Inspector Matthew gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set with determination. His mind raced as they sped along the winding mountain roads. He had trusted too many people in the past and had been burned more than once. But this time was different. This time, he knew exactly who his enemies were, and he was determined to stay one step ahead of them. "The monastery is up ahead," he said, glancing at Elodie. "It's been abandoned for decades. No one goes there anymore." "That's why it's the perfect place," Elodie replied. "If the Cathars hid the relic anywhere, it would be somewhere like this, isolated, forgotten." Matthew nodded. "Let's hope we're the first to get there." The monastery of St. Michel. The monastery loomed before them, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Ivy clung to the ancient structure, and the heavy wooden doors creaked as Matthew pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old stone. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns on the floor. Rows of crumbling pews stretched toward an altar shrouded in shadow. Claire shivered. "It's eerie," she whispered, "like the walls are watching us." Elodie stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. This place was once a sanctuary, a place of knowledge and protection. But it's been forgotten for too long. Matthew pulled out his flashlight and scanned the room. "If the relic is here, it's well hidden. We need to move fast." They began their search, splitting up to cover different areas of the monastery. Elodie focused on the altar, running her fingers over the carvings. Symbols similar to those on the scrolls decorated the stone, worn but still visible. "This is it," she called out. "The symbols match. There's something beneath this altar." Matthew and Claire joined her, and together they pushed the heavy stone aside, revealing a dark staircase that descended into the depths of the monastery. The underground chamber. The air grew colder as they made their way down the stone steps, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The staircase spiraled downward, seemingly endless, until it opened into a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with ancient texts and relics, their surfaces glowing faintly in the dim light. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it rested a small, intricately carved box. Elodie's breath caught in her throat. The relic. She approached slowly, her heart pounding. The box seemed almost alive, its carvings shifting in the light. She reached out and touched it, her fingers tingling as they brushed against its surface. Claire stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "What is it?" "I don't know," Elodie replied, "but it's more than we expected. This could change everything." Matthew stood guard at the entrance, his eyes scanning the darkness. "We don't have much time. If La Chambre Noire is following us, they'll be here soon." Elodie nodded. "We need to take it and go." But as she lifted the box from the pedestal, a deep rumble echoed through the chamber. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and ancient mechanisms groaned to life. "The door!" Claire shouted. "It's closing." Matthew sprinted toward the staircase. "Move! Now!" A desperate escape. The walls of the chamber began to collapse as they raced up the staircase, debris raining down around them. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Elodie clutched the relic tightly, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to keep going. Behind her, the sound of falling stone grew louder. They burst back into the main hall of the monastery, just as the final section of the staircase caved in, sealing the underground chamber forever. Matthew doubled over, gasping for breath. That was too close. Claire wiped the dust from her face, her eyes wide with shock. What the hell just happened? Elodie looked down at the relic in her hands. It was a trap, a mechanism designed to protect the relic. The Cathars didn't just hide it. They made sure no one could take it without facing the consequences. The shadow arrives. Before they could catch their breath, the sound of engines echoed from outside the monastery. Matthew drew his gun, his eyes narrowing. "They found us," he said. Elodie's heart sank. La Chambre Noire. The doors of the monastery burst open, and a group of armed men poured in, their weapons trained on the trio. Agent Noir stepped forward, his arm in a sling from the gunshot wound Matthew had given him earlier. Well, well, he said with a smirk. "Thank you for doing the hard work for us. We'll take that now." Matthew raised his gun. "Not a chance." Agent Noir chuckled. "Do you really think you can stop us? You're outnumbered, outgunned. Be smart, Inspector. Hand over the relic, and we'll let you live." Elodie glanced at Claire, then at Matthew. She could see the tension in his jaw, the calculation in his eyes. Then she made a decision. "Fine," she said, holding out the box. "You want it? Take it." Agent Noir's eyes gleamed with triumph as he reached for the relic. But just before his fingers touched it, Elodie pressed a hidden latch on the side of the box. A burst of light erupted from the box, blinding everyone in the room. "Run!" Elodie shouted. The chase continues. They bolted for the side entrance, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the landscape in an eerie red glow. Matthew led the way, his gun drawn, scanning for any signs of danger. Claire followed close behind, her grip tight on the chest. Elodie glanced over her shoulder, her pulse racing. The men from La Chambre, Noir were recovering quickly. They wouldn't have much time before they gave chase. "We need to lose them," Matthew said, his voice steady despite the urgency. "There's a forest on the other side of the ridge. If we can reach it, we might be able to disappear." They ran, the sound of footsteps and shouts growing louder behind them. The forest of secrets. The trees closed in around them, the shadows deepening as they plunged into the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the ground was uneven beneath their feet. Matthew slowed, listening carefully. "This way," he said, leading them toward a narrow path that wound deeper into the woods. Elodie's heart pounded in her chest. She could still feel the weight of the relic in her hands, its significance pressing down on her. Claire's voice broke the silence. "What now?" Elodie met her gaze, determination blazing in her eyes. "We keep running. We find out what this relic really is. And we end this, once and for all." Night fell swiftly over the Pyrenees, the dark forest swallowing the last traces of daylight. Twisted branches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers, and the path ahead became harder to see with each step. The air was cold and damp, filled with the scent of pine and decay. Elodie led the way, her grip tight around the relic, its strange carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. Behind her, Claire struggled to keep up, her breathing ragged. Matthew brought up the rear, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of pursuit. "They're still following us," Matthew said, his voice low but urgent. Elodie glanced over her shoulder, her heart skipping a beat. "How much farther to the village?" "Not far," Matthew replied, "but it's dangerous. The locals, they don't trust outsiders. They've guarded their secrets for generations. We'll need to be careful." Claire gave a weak laugh. "Careful? We're running from a secret society that's been hunting us for weeks. I think careful went out the window a long time ago." Elodie reached out and squeezed Claire's hand. "We'll get through this. We have to." The village of Rock Noir. The village appeared out of nowhere, hidden deep within a valley surrounded by towering cliffs. The houses were ancient, built from dark stone with steep, slate roofs. Lanterns flickered in the windows, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. An old woman stood at the entrance to the village, her eyes sharp and unblinking. She held a lantern in one hand, its light barely illuminating her weathered face. "Elodie," Matthew whispered, "let me handle this." He stepped forward and spoke to the woman in Occitan, the old dialect of the region. Her eyes narrowed, her gaze flicking between the three of them. Finally, she nodded and motioned for them to follow her. "She'll let us stay," Matthew said, "but we have to be careful. This village has its own rules." The sanctuary. The old woman led them to a small, stone house at the edge of the village. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. The walls were lined with books and ancient artifacts, some of them bearing the same symbols as the relic. Elodie placed the relic on the table, her eyes tracing the carvings. "We need answers. We need to know what this is." The old woman, who introduced herself as Madame Leonie, sat across from them, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "It's been a long time since anyone sought the truth," Leonie said, her voice raspy but strong. "The relic you carry is far older than you realize. It is one of the last surviving pieces of the Cathar treasure, a key to knowledge that was meant to be hidden forever." Matthew leaned forward. "Hidden from whom?" "From those who would use it for power," Leonie replied. "La Chambre, Noir has hunted the relics for centuries. They believe they hold the key to immortality and ultimate knowledge. But the truth is far more dangerous." Elodie's pulse quickened. "Dangerous how?" Leonie's gaze darkened. "The relic isn't just a key. It's a weapon, a doorway to something beyond our understanding. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything." Claire's face paled. "Then why did the Cathars create it?" "They didn't create it," Leonie said. "They found it, and they paid the price for their discovery. A fragile trust." Silence filled the room as the weight of Leonie's words settled over them. Matthew rubbed his temples, the exhaustion catching up with him. "We've been running for weeks, risking our lives for something we don't fully understand. We need a plan. We need to figure out how to stop La Chambre Noire. Elodie nodded. Leonie, is there a way to destroy the relic? Leonie hesitated. There is, but it's not easy. You would have to return it to the source, to the place where it was first found. Only there can its power be undone. And where is that? Claire asked. Leonie's eyes flickered toward the window, where the full moon hung low in the sky. Montségur, the mountain fortress of the Cathars. It's the only place strong enough to contain its power. Matthew cursed under his breath. Montségur is heavily guarded. If La Chambre Noire knows we're headed there, they'll be waiting for us. Elodie straightened her shoulders. Then we'll have to be smarter than them. A whisper of betrayal. As night deepened, the village grew quiet. Elodie and Claire sat near the fire, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten as they pored over the relic's symbols. Matthew stepped outside, needing a moment to clear his head. The cool night air wrapped around him, and he closed his eyes, letting the tension drain from his body. But as he stood there, a voice cut through the darkness. You should hand them over to us, Inspector. It's the only way to save them. Matthew's eyes snapped open, and his hand instinctively went to his gun. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face partially hidden beneath a dark hood. It was Agent Noir, his wound hastily bandaged, but his eyes burning with determination. You're persistent, Matthew said coldly. Agent Noir smiled. I'm practical. You know how this ends. They can't win. Give us the relic, and I'll make sure you and your friends walk away alive. Matthew hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't trust Noir, but he couldn't deny the truth in his words. They were outnumbered, outmatched. You have until dawn, Noir said. Think about it. Then he melted back into the shadows, leaving Matthew alone with his thoughts. The decision. Back inside the house, Elodie noticed the change in Matthew's expression the moment he returned. What happened? She asked. Nothing, he lied. Just needed some air. But Elodie wasn't convinced. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the doubt gnawing at him. Matthew, whatever it is, you can tell us, Claire said gently. Matthew looked at them, his heart heavy with the weight of his choices. We're running out of time, he said. We leave for Montségur at first light. Be ready. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, none of them noticed the shadow watching from the window, waiting, listening. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in pale pinks and oranges as Elodie, Matthew, and Claire prepared to leave Rock Noir. The villagers watched in silence, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. Madame Leonie stood at the threshold of her home, her expression grave. You must move quickly, she warned. La Chambre Noire will not stop until they have the relic. They know where you're going. If you hesitate, they will catch you. Elodie tightened the straps on her pack. We won't hesitate. Thank you for everything. Madame Leonie handed her a small leather pouch. Take this. You may need it before the end. Elodie opened the pouch and found a handful of ancient coins, each engraved with the same symbols as the relic. She nodded, slipping the pouch into her jacket. Matthew adjusted his gun holster and glanced at the rising sun. We need to go. Into the wild. The path to Montségur was treacherous, winding through dense forests and up steep cliffs. Snow still clung to the higher peaks, and the air grew colder with every step. Elodie's legs burned as she climbed, but she refused to slow down. Her mind raced with questions about the relic, about what they would find at Montségur and what it would cost them. Claire walked in silence beside her, her face pale and drawn. She had barely spoken since they left Rock Noir, her thoughts seemingly a million miles away. Matthew brought up the rear, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He knew they were being followed. He could feel it, a presence just out of sight, watching, waiting. Elodie, he said quietly, we're not alone. Elodie froze, her hand tightening around the relic. How close? Close enough, Matthew replied. We need to pick up the pace. They pushed onward, their footsteps quickening. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees whispering secrets in the wind. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. The ambush. As they rounded a bend in the path, a sudden movement caught Matthew's eye. He barely had time to react before a figure stepped out from behind a tree, gun raised. Down! Matthew shouted, diving for cover. Elodie and Claire hit the ground as bullets tore through the air, splintering the trees around them. More figures emerged from the shadows, agents of La Chambre Noire, their faces obscured by black masks. Matthew returned fire, his shots precise and controlled. Stay behind me, he yelled. Elodie clutched the relic to her chest, her heart hammering in her ribcage. Claire crawled toward a fallen tree, her eyes wide with terror. "We're pinned down," Claire shouted. "We need to move." Matthew called back. He scanned the terrain, searching for an escape route. His eyes locked onto a narrow ravine just ahead. "There," he pointed. "Run for the ravine. I'll cover you." Elodie hesitated. "Matthew, go," he barked. Elodie grabbed Claire's hand and sprinted toward the ravine, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Bullets whizzed past them, but she didn't look back. Matthew fired a final shot and then turned to follow, his boots pounding against the rocky ground. The agents pursued them, their footsteps echoing through the forest. The ravine. The ravine was narrow and steep, its walls lined with jagged rocks. A stream trickled through the center, its icy waters glinting in the early morning light. Elodie slipped on the wet stones, barely catching herself before she fell. Claire pulled her upright, her grip firm despite her trembling hands. "Keep going," Claire urged. "We're almost there." Matthew caught up with them, his chest heaving. "We can't stay here. They'll be on us in minutes." Elodie looked around, her eyes darting between the towering cliffs. "There's a cave up ahead," she said, pointing. "We can hide there." They scrambled toward the cave, their footsteps splashing through the stream. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber inside. Matthew leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "We'll rest here for a few minutes, then keep moving." Elodie nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "We're close to Montsegur. If we can make it there, we'll have the high ground. It'll be easier to defend ourselves." Claire sat down on a rock, her face pale. "Do you think we'll find what we're looking for?" Elodie met her gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to." The shadow of betrayal. As they rested, the air grew heavy with tension. Matthew checked his weapon, his expression unreadable. He hadn't told Elodie or Claire about his encounter with Agent Noir back in Rock Noir. The words echoed in his mind. "You have until dawn." He glanced at Elodie, his heart twisting with guilt. He had made a choice that could either save them or doom them all. But before he could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the cave. "They found us," Matthew whispered. Elodie gripped the relic tighter. "We can't let them take it." Matthew nodded. "Stay behind me. No matter what happens, you keep moving." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Shadows flickered at the entrance to the cave. Then all hell broke loose. The final stand. The agents stormed into the cave, their guns raised. Matthew fired first, his bullets sparking against the stone walls. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Elodie and Claire ducked behind a boulder, their hearts racing. Elodie clutched the relic, its carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. "We can't hold them off forever," Claire shouted. Matthew gritted his teeth. "We won't have to, just long enough to get out of here." Suddenly, a figure appeared in the entrance, a man clad in black, his face hidden beneath a hood. "Agent Noir." "It's over," Noir said, his voice calm and cold. "Give me the relic, and I'll let you live." Elodie stood, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You'll have to kill me first." Noir smiled. "That can be arranged." Matthew raised his gun, but before he could fire, Noir moved faster than seemed possible, disarming him with a single swift motion. Elodie backed away, her heart pounding. She glanced at Claire, then at Matthew. She knew they couldn't win this fight. Not here, not now. But she also knew they couldn't give up. "We're not done yet," she whispered. Montsegur loomed above them like a ghost from the past. The ancient fortress clung to the cliffside, its crumbling walls bathed in the pale light of the rising sun. The air was heavy with an ominous stillness, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Elodie stood at the base of the narrow path leading up to the fortress, her heart pounding in her chest. The relic, warm against her skin, seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Montsegur," she whispered. "It's been waiting for us." Matthew scanned the horizon, his eyes sharp and wary. "We don't have much time. They'll be here soon." Claire shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Do you feel that? It's like the air is charged." "It's the relic," Matthew said. "It's reacting to this place." Elodie clenched her fists. "Then we're in the right place. This is where it ends. The Fortress of Shadows." The climb to the fortress was brutal, the path steep and treacherous. Wind howled through the cliffs, carrying with it the scent of ancient stone and forgotten battles. Montsegur had stood for centuries, a symbol of resistance and loss. Its walls had witnessed unspeakable horrors, and now it would witness one final confrontation. They reached the outer gate, its massive wooden doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, the courtyard was a maze of crumbling walls and overgrown weeds. "We need to find the central chamber," Elodie said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "That's where the relic must be returned." Matthew nodded. "Stay close. This place is a perfect spot for an ambush." As they moved deeper into the fortress, the air grew colder. Shadows danced across the stone walls, and the relic's glow grew brighter, illuminating the ancient symbols carved into the stone. Claire ran her fingers over one of the carvings. "These symbols, they're the same as on the relic. This must be the place." But before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. "They're here," Matthew said, drawing his gun. The final stand. The first wave of attackers burst into the chamber, their faces hidden behind black masks. Matthew fired without hesitation, his shots echoing off the stone walls. "Elodie, go," he shouted. "I'll hold them off." Elodie hesitated, her eyes locking with Matthew's. She knew what he was doing, buying them time, even if it meant sacrificing himself. "No," she said fiercely. "We do this together." Matthew opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, Claire grabbed Elodie's arm. "She's right. We need you." Reluctantly, Matthew nodded. "Then let's finish this." The three of them moved as one, fighting their way toward the central chamber. Bullets ricocheted off the stone, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Agent Noir appeared in the doorway, his face calm and confident. "You've come a long way," he said, "but this is where your story ends." Elodie raised the relic, its glow intensifying. "You'll have to kill us first." Noir smiled. "If that's what it takes." The power of the relic. The relic began to hum, its carvings glowing with a blinding light. The air crackled with energy, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. "Elodie!" Claire shouted. "What's happening?" "The relic," Elodie gasped. "It's reacting to the chamber. It's unlocking something." Stone walls shifted and groaned, revealing a hidden passage beneath the floor. A staircase spiraled downward into darkness, its steps worn smooth by centuries of use. "Noir doesn't want the relic," Elodie realized. "He wants what's beneath Montsegur." Noir stepped toward the staircase, his eyes gleaming with triumph. The Cathars were the last to guard the gateway. They thought they could hide it forever, but everything hidden must eventually be found. Elodie's heart raced. "Gateway? To what?" Noir turned to her, his smile widening. "To power beyond imagining. Into the abyss." Elodie exchanged a glance with Claire and Matthew. "We have to stop him." Without waiting for a response, she descended the staircase, the relic lighting her way. Matthew and Claire followed close behind, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. The passage opened into a vast cavern, its walls glittering with crystals that pulsed in time with the relic's glow. At the center of the cavern stood an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with the same symbols that covered the relic. Noir stood before the altar, his hands raised in reverence. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Centuries of blood and sacrifice, all leading to this moment." "Elodie," Matthew said quietly. "We can't let him activate it." Elodie nodded, her grip tightening on the relic. "Noir," she called. "It's over. Step away from the altar." Noir turned to face her, his eyes blazing with madness. "You don't understand. This isn't just a relic. It's a key to a power that can reshape the world. We can use it to create something new, something better." Elodie shook her head. "Power like that doesn't create. It only destroys." Noir laughed. "Then let it destroy." The collapse. The ground began to shake violently, cracks spreading across the cavern floor. Energy erupted from the altar, spiraling upward in a column of blinding light. "Elodie!" Claire screamed. "Do something." Elodie raised the relic, its light merging with the energy from the altar. She could feel its power coursing through her, threatening to tear her apart. "Noir!" she shouted. "If you activate this, you'll destroy us all." But Noir only laughed, his voice echoing through the cavern. "Then let it be destroyed." Elodie's vision blurred as the energy intensified, but she refused to let go. She focused all her strength, willing the relic to close the gateway. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The light dimmed, and the cavern grew deathly silent. Then, with a deafening roar, the gateway collapsed in on itself, the energy imploding and dragging Noir into the abyss. Aftermath. The cavern fell still, the air thick with dust and the scent of burned stone. Elodie collapsed to her knees, the relic falling from her hands. "Elodie!" Claire ran to her side, tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay?" Elodie nodded weakly. "It's over." Matthew knelt beside them, his eyes scanning the cavern. "Noir's gone. The gateway is sealed. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their victory settling over them. What now? Claire asked softly. Elodie picked up the relic, its glow now faded to a soft, gentle light. We take it somewhere safe, somewhere it can never be used again. Matthew helped her to her feet. And then we disappear. No more running, no more hiding. We get our lives back. Elodie smiled faintly. I'd like that. Epilogue. The sun rose over Montsegur, bathing the fortress in golden light. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind carried with it the scent of fresh pine. Elodie, Claire, and Matthew stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the sunrise in silence. The world felt new, full of promise and possibility. They had survived. They had won. But deep in the shadows beneath Montsegur, something stirred, a reminder that some secrets are never truly buried.